He's better known for photographic portraits of powerful world leaders. Among the 130 or so politicians in his portfolio are Barack Obama, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and the Burmese democracy campaigner Aung San Suu Kyi. One of his most famous images was the Russian Premier Vladimir Putin for Time magazine's Person of the Year cover in 2007. But now the photographer Platon is pointing his lens in another direction. Last year, he teamed up with the pressure group Human Rights Watch to make a photo essay about Russian political activists. Platon, who is known professionally only by his first name, photographed characters from the country's emerging civil society movement. Among them were Yuri Schmidt, the human rights lawyer who represented the jailed oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Others included a group of environmental activists who were camped out in the Khimki forest outside Moscow in a bid to stop a highway construction project. The photo essay, called Acting Up Russia's Civil Society, was made before the country erupted into protests amid allegations of election fraud last month. But it has only been released after Russia's opposition movement reared its head in such a dramatic way. To look at this further, I'm joined by the New York-based photographer, Platon, to get his take on Russian activism. Platon, it's a really interesting project. How did it come about?
What's happening is that I've forged an amazing relationship with Human Rights Watch, and they're allowing me to turn my lens away from the people who have the power to the people who have been robbed of power. And together I'm trying to create a new set of cultural heroes, people who have shown great courage in the face of oppression, people who are prepared to really stand up for human rights and civil rights.
You make world leaders look powerful artistically, photographically, using your lens. Were you doing something different when you were in Russia with the civil society activists?
The people I met, which was probably about 130 people, 120 people from civil society, I was so inspired. I found them open, courageous, honest, humble, and there was this sort of special spirit that they all had. And I just wanted to do them justice. I wanted to document them. I mean, many of them have never had their portrait taken in a proper way. And I felt it's very important that we identify that there is an incredible movement creating a civil society in Russia, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, the last 20 years. Right now, there's a civil society that is alive and kicking, and it crosses all boundaries, different cultures, different ages, different outlooks. But these people are coming together to say, if the establishment is not going to look after us, then we need to look after ourselves and create an infrastructure that is very humane.
And were there any individuals among this disparate group of people that you photographed that particularly impressed you?
There was a lady called Lola, who was a homeless lady. She was 34 years old and had a daughter, but she looks like she's 78. She's had a really rough life. She's been beaten up. She's been abused. And in Moscow, on the streets, if you're a homeless person, you're exposed to the worst kind of life you can imagine. And there is a new group that are setting themselves up to look after homeless people. And this lady, I remember we chatted to each other on the streets. And I said to her at the end of our shoot, if there was one wish you could have, what would it be? And she said, I wish happiness for you. And I said to her, if I ever needed to meet someone who could do with a wish for themselves, it's you. And I said, I can't believe you're wishing happiness for me instead of yourself. And she said, kindness is the most important thing to all of man. And I remembered suddenly that that's what Aung San Suu Kyi told me when I photographed her. And I found there's an amazing connection with someone, there's perhaps one of the most famous women on the planet, who is Aung San Suu Kyi, who is really dedicated her life to improving her nation. And I found this person on the streets of Russia who is not an intellectual, who suffered the worst life you can imagine, and yet still had a similar outlook. And for me, that was like the full cycle of people turning around and respecting fellow man and woman.
You've photographed everyone from Barack Obama to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Dmitry Medvedev to Muammar Gaddafi. Do you have any selection criteria for subjects?
I always wanted to be part of the times I'm living in. And I remember my parents would always talk about the 1960s generation as an incredible thing to be part of. And my generation seemed to grow up a little lost. We never had that. We never had a Martin Luther King. We never had a Malcolm X. We never had the leaders and the popular cultural leaders that came from the 60s. So I now find myself part of something that I could never have imagined. Through my work as a portrait photographer, I now have had some incredible, intimate moments with the people who are changing history. And it's not just the power brokers. I'm actually more interested in the people. There's a new leadership now. Leadership is changing, and we can see it around the world. It's shifting from the people in authority to the people on the streets. And if, in theory, the people who are leading our countries are there to serve us, are elected to look after our best interests, and when that doesn't happen and power does get corrupted, I think people now have more confidence than a long, long time ago to stand up and come together en masse to make a bold statement, to say we want more, we want better, we were promised more.
This point about getting both sides of the story, one of your subjects was Vladimir Putin, the Time magazine Person of the Year cover back in 2007. Now you've been over to Russia with the civil society activists. Does that mean that you've been on both sides of this story, and what perspective does that give you?
I have seen both sides. I've witnessed power at its pinnacle with Putin. It's not just him, but it's the machine around him. And when you're face-to-face with it, it permeates your skin. I mean, it's so overwhelming. So I've witnessed that, and I've had some very sort of intimate moments with him to get that close to him. I was an inch and a half from his nose, and we had some very intimate discussions. But then I've experienced the same potency with the people from civil society. There's so many amazing stories from all the people I met. There was one woman, for instance, who has set up an organization to look after battered women or abused women. And as I was talking to her, she remembered that there was one person that slipped through her net. And it was a woman who said that, who called her on the phone and was terrified and said, my husband is a very important person. If he knew I was making this call, I would be killed straight away. He beats me, he abuses me, he threatens me with my life each day. And I remember the woman I was photographing was explaining how she tried to keep this terrified woman on the phone. And something happened, there was a distraction, and the woman hung up, and she never contacted her again. And as I photographed this lady who runs this organization, a tear rolled down her cheek. And it wasn't the tear of a victim. It was the tear of someone who is dedicating their life to doing something important, to helping people. It was actually the tear of strength in many ways. And that's what I try to focus on as a photographer. When I'm photographing civil society, I don't want them to appear as downtrodden people who are fighting an impossible battle. That's not the people I found. I found them empowered. I found them dedicated, courageous, impassioned by life. And I genuinely believe they are the new cultural heroes of our time.
That was Platon, the New York-based photographer.